How are we doing, guys? I'm GC McKay, and today we're going to be taking a look at Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. First published in 1866, through a serialization during the whole year from January to December, Crime and Punishment tells the story of Rodion Raskolnikov, a former student living in St. Petersburg who is stricken by abject poverty and who is contemplating the idea of murdering a pawnbroker who is basically an old hag who steals everyone's money whenever she can, charges colossal interest on the items she takes in, and whom everyone around Raskolnikov seems to despise. He's basically in this dire straits situation. He has a mother and sister who live outside of St. Petersburg, and they've sacrificed a hell of a lot for him to try and get ahead in life, and that only adds to the weight of his burden considering the position that he's in. We meet him when he's already thinking about killing this woman, but he's also in a feverish kind of delirium at the beginning as well as afterwards, and the reason for that is probably due to his poverty, but also the fact that he's just not looking after himself, and he's already in this emotional turmoil throughout. And let's fucking just go ahead and say it, he does axe the bitch, and afterwards he has to deal with the ramifications of doing so. And for me, where the really interesting part is, that plays throughout the whole novel, is when an article is brought up that he wrote and that was published unbeknownst to him and unbeknownst to us, and it's announced to him when this investigator called Porphyry, he turns up shortly after the murder, and obviously he wants to question Raskolnikov because he was the only person not to come back to the pawnbrokers, or at least to the police office, to find out if he can get his possessions back. So that already triggered an alarm bell, and he was the one who read this article. I should have mentioned that Raskolnikov actually fucking axed the half-wit, half-sister of the pawnbroker as well, because she happened to turn up. But maybe I'll get onto that a bit later. But so really he commits 2 acts of murder. And I think it's especially significant because of this article, because it talks about what Nietzsche also talked about later on in his writings, about this idea of an Übermensch, and how extraordinary men should be exempt from the laws of society if they see it fit to do so. They are basically able to transgress, commit horrific acts, because it will serve for the greater good of humanity. So you've got that on one side, and on the other side you've got the mice of society, which I would clearly say is the the slave mentality, as opposed to the master mentality, which was Nietzsche's later idea. The parallels between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are quite uncanny at times, especially so in this novel. And this dualism that happens, because the reason I mentioned the sister getting killed as well is because it basically represents both sides of the argument a lot of the time. And with Raskolnikov's name meaning schism in Russian, obviously this split kind of dynamic that's going on throughout the piece really makes it quite a fascinating read. And if you haven't read it, I'm not spoiling it for you, because it's not a plot-driven piece, it's a very character-driven piece. And whilst I am going to try and discuss the ideas that are involved, I'm not going to particularly mention them, outright and tell you exactly what happens, because you'll have your own interpretation of it anyway. This is just mine. So, yeah. The dualism, basically, of this article feeds into the whole thing. And the fact that Rodion can't even fucking remember writing it, really, it's quite significant, really, because it gives him away massively. And this Porphyry character who's investigating the case, he sees that straight away. And it's not only mirrored by the pawnbroker and her half-wit sister, but also by Rodion's mother and sister. The mother would be the weaker one in this regard, as the sister would be the stronger one. And another character who's a landowner, basically a perverted motherfucker as well. He's a real deviant throughout the piece. But he does represent the Übermensch as well, or the Superman, or whatever we want to call him, of these extraordinary men. And his name's Shridrigailov, or Shridrigailov. It's difficult to pronounce, but that's one the tricky thing about Russian fucking novels as well, is when you're not accustomed to these names, they're fucking confusing, because they switch in between, and it's got the kind of, they're all massive names. I mean, it's a bit of a fucking task, let's say. It's worth taking notes when you're reading them. And Sonia, who plays a prostitute in the story, she also represents the kind of weaker side of Raskolnikov's argument. And throughout the rest of the novel, we're all kind of in this kind of, good and evil, extraordinary and ordinary, and this kind of thing. And obviously, if you were Raskolnikov and you wrote that piece and you really believed in it, which of the side would you think you're on? And that's what Porfiry really is intrigued by, because obviously you'd assume that this guy Raskolnikov would think that he is part of this Übermensch mentality, and therefore he can commit horrific acts. And he gives himself away so much within this piece, but it is just an article. It's not any official evidence. I imagine, due to the time of its, birth, if you will, that they didn't have stuff like forensics or anything like that. So it's all kind of down to witnesses and things like that. But really, Porfiry wants to get Raskolnikov to confess, and Raskolnikov basically battles himself throughout the rest of the novel, trying to decide whether or not he wants to do it. If you haven't read it, stop it here and fuck off. But if you have, I will now say that he does eventually confess. The reason I picked it up again recently, though, is because whilst I was listening to 12 Rules for a Judeo-Christian Life by Jordan Perterson, he states quite sweepingly during some part of it that you are not an atheist. And Crime and Punishment is proof that you are not an atheist. And that just triggered something in me. I'm not sure why, because I've read it before. And I was fascinated to read it again just with that in mind, really, because it's such an audacious remark that I thought, really? It's not. It doesn't prove that you're not an atheist. I think, for me, what it proves is that you can't write your own value system, which again does tie in with the Nietzsche idea, because he wanted to do that at some point, and I believe he set out to do it, but he never completed any text or anything, because you can't fucking do it. And Peterson has said this as well in many of his lectures and interviews. And I can agree with that part, but I've got to say bullshit on the whole. It doesn't prove that you're not an atheist. I think what it proves is you are not your own God. I think that would be a better way to view it, to be honest. I think that's what it really is saying. And my main beef with Dostoevsky's stuff is his whole religious connotation within basically all of his novels. But, because for me, if you can't find the flaw in Christianity especially, then I've got to question your judgment just a teeny little bit, because come on, I mean, really? Do you think it's like everything's down to salvation and all this stuff? During the time Dostoevsky was writing it, it was during this utilitarian movement, or something like that, the utilitarian, that kind of movement. And that's where the birth of this nihilist kind of idea came around. And Raskolnikov is really one of these types that's trying to reject the old society's ways and move forward. And usually just with science, basically, and to forget the kind of religious side of things. So if we forget the religious side for a moment and say Dostoevsky had a beef with this because he was talking more about the spiritual side of humanity, and most importantly, like he notes with Notes from Underground, is that man is inherently irrational. So to say that we can move forward and progress as a species by just using our rational minds, believing that we are all in it for the greater good and we all want to be we all want to better ourselves is absolute bollocks. And in that regard, I completely agree with Dostoevsky, and I think Crime and Punishment and Notes from Underground make a massive commentary on that, and they're really on the fucking money. I think what makes the novel so fascinating to read as well, and I think this is the other reason that he changed it from a first-person narration to a third-person omniscient narration, is because of this idea of God within it, and the idea of trying to believe that you can step out of your own morality, essentially. But what I think is interesting is because during the first part, you're interweaving within the kind of third person and then into, Raskolnikov's mindset a lot of the time. And so many moments in it, you're into this feverish delirium a lot of the time, and you kind of, sometimes you're reading it and you're going, where the fuck is he? And stuff like that, and you're just suddenly, he's like, oh, I'm standing outside the pawnbroker's house, or I'm on a bridge, across the other side of the place, and all this stuff. And although it does pay respects to the area of the time, the expansion of St. Petersburg feels endless a lot of the time. And I think it is a real kind of penetration of Raskolnikov's subconscious almost, because he enters such a delirium because of what he's done and the guilt he has to live with, and the fact that he's been someone who's so stubborn and so intellectual, yet he's given in to this kind of impulse, basically, because he doesn't plan the murder at all. He's wandering around during one of his kind of moral dilemmas, and he overhears that the sister's not going to be there that evening, and then he's like, oh sweet, now I can go and kill that fucking bitch. And it's just like everything's done on impulse, and he doesn't take time to think about it. So there's no mythology behind his thinking. There's no what do they call it when you fucking predetermined. There's no kind of notion of him plotting this whole murder in the first place. But to him, in his theories and the way he's been thinking about it, of course he thinks it's been planned out completely. But it isn't at all. And the fact that he has to kill her, it makes you wonder, it's like, why does he have to fucking kill her? Just go and bang the door in, balaclava yourself up, tie her up, throw her in the corner, and just have off with her goods. Why do you have to kill her? And these are the kind of dilemmas that he has to face afterwards, because he realises that he's not really one or the other, essentially. And I think, really, that's what Peterson should have said. To be honest, I think Peterson makes these kind of religious claims a lot of the time, and he uses a lot of biblical text to underline his points. But for me, he does it in a Machiavellian sense, that because he said that you need a religion. And I think instead of picking a particular religion because of modern times, what Peterson does is actually just uses loads of different religious texts to support his claims, while sitting on the fence of whether or not he actually believes in any of it, from as far as I'm aware anyway. And yeah, the hyperbole of saying you are not a fucking atheist because you have a value system is bullshit. But it's not a detriment to the novel, and I'll end it here because it's fucking worth reading, without a doubt. And it's not a detriment to the novel because I don't think Dostoevsky actually comes up with any conclusive answers, because he is within a literary kind of element, but also he doesn't really press this whole idea of like, oh, you need religion and salvation and stuff like that. He actually just constantly puts it into question. He's like a fucking scientist the way he approaches his art. So if he has a theory on what he thinks is true or innate, he will torture himself via the kind of villainous characters in his pieces, and they will question and debate and constantly have, basically from every angle that he could think of, basically try to disprove these beliefs. And although I disagree with Dostoevsky's overall kind of impression, I think what he does so brilliantly is actually extends what he sets out to do, and he creates pieces that are timeless, really, that they'll always be applicable to the human mind. And The only time I found it got a bit preachy in Crime and Punishment is right at the end. The epilogue finishes it off and like Raskolnikov is in love with this Sonia woman and Sonia's in love with him and they're setting out to correct things and she's bringing in the Bible and all this stuff, but he hasn't found redemption yet, but salvation shall come, but we can't detail this here because this is where the novel ends and all this stuff. So it's a bit wanky, if I'm honest. But just before that, Raskolnikov is actually saying that he doesn't feel guilty because he killed that old hag. He feels guilty because he was too weak to accept it, to really live with it like the other characters within the piece did. And for him, that's his kind of where his moral quandrum is still very apparent. And yeah, I don't think it's too preachy. I think he was initially, I mean, I heard that Notes from Underground had a lot of religious text in it in the first few drafts or whatever. And luckily the editors swiped that out because they were like, what's this Jesus shit? Throw that. And yeah, I think it does nothing but behoove these texts. And yeah, I mean, it's been made into films, Crime and Punishment that is, loads of times now. And, you know, it's just a, what do you want? Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you for watching. If you're an atheist, you can read this novel. It's not going to disprove your beliefs. It might make you question them. And yeah, you might think you're above morality, but until you put yourself to the test, and if you really, really think about it, the reason you don't do it is because you know you're not. I don't think it's worth testing that. I think that's what the novel really is saying. I mean, it says a lot more as well. This is just my main impressions of it and the things I enjoy from it the most. I do think it goes on too long. That's another slight gripe I've got with some of Dostoevsky's texts, is they do drag on and on. I mean, there's a letter from his mother in it early on. It goes on for about fucking 8 or 9 pages. It's just a complete info dump. And it's just like, oh God, it's just banging on and on and on and on and on and on. And it just gets a bit like, oh God, man. Those are my only beefs with it. But I've got to remember, and I think you should as well if you haven't read it, that it was written in the 19th century, so people used to read back then. So you got to give them a bit of credit. They didn't have fucking Netflix and chill. So, because, you know, they didn't have birth control either. So the conditions those people lived in sucked. So I think we can give him a bit of credit for that. And yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I'll be back next week with some more, no doubt. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, lastly, I keep forgetting about this fucking giveaway winner thing, but thank you very much, Thomas Stone. You were the winner for the last one. I think the next one's probably in the next video. This is how long it's been since I mentioned it. But Thomas Stone, you chose to have a copy of Fubar. Good fucking man. If none of you have picked it up yet, I think you should, because the reviews coming in, they're impressive. Even I'm shocked so far. So it's been very nice to get such high praise for the piece, because it drove me insane writing it. So yeah, and if you're into Dostoevsky's stuff, I do kind of think I'm definitely influenced by him. So you might get a lot out of it. But then again, mine's full of profanity and fucking pretty grim material, to be honest. That's all I'll say. But the reviews also say this as well in better detail. So if you want to check it out, the links are in the video description. Thank you very much for watching. And I'll see you bitches next week. Adios.